Okay, I'm beginning a video discussion of uh, the uh, Technologia paper by McKnight and myself. Um, and hopefully I can keep this to about 30 minutes. Let me go ahead and share my screen. I have a basic outline. Let me expand this. Okay, so as the title says, we're kind of as authors, we're digging into, if you will, sort of the origins of our technological understandings, particularly when it comes to an American understanding, so in the United States. And when I use American, I would suggest I am meaning more than the US. So Canada would, I think, would be part of that, because they were influenced by the Puritans as well, particularly post-American Revolution. So loyalist Puritans would have all moved to either the maritime provinces in Canada, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, particularly, and to some degree Ontario. I'm probably not meaning any more than the United States and Canada to some degree. So anyway, gives you a little background. So begin with the question of what is technology? And for most of you, technology is the device that you're viewing this video. It's electronic. It's both hardware and software. It's applications. It's the things that help you remain connected to people, across the globe. I'm connected to a number of people outside of the U.S. through technology, although I can say not many. So that's kind of what we believe. It's a gadget, it's a widget, if you will. It's which is an older term. So, but I'm going to give you a definition you can see on the screen. That technology is really a way of thinking that is born out of a technique, okay, that is born out of a way of doing. Could be understood as a form of life, okay? So in a form of life here is something less than a culture. It's not the same as a culture. It's not the same as society. But it's in and around, it's a form of life that we live in and around the device. So many of us may identify with our ancestors, recent ancestors, particularly in the Bayou region. We may think of ourselves as Acadian or Cajun, and we may think of ourselves as Creole. We may think of ourselves as, I don't know, River Parish. That's a similar but different culture. I'm kind of both River Parish and Acadian in my own cultural background. But the way we live our life has more to do with that smartphone than with a Pura. Okay, um, as is a way of being, right? So think of, you know, 100 years ago, before we had all the roads that we have. You could even probably go back 70 years. And we got around on boats. And so the way we lived our life was very much tied to the watercraft. Okay. Maybe to a horse and buggy in town. Okay. So, you know, maybe what we used, those that come out of small land holding, ran a farm, whether you grew rice or sugar cane or whatever. So it was very much tied to those technologies. So again, so we can think of a technology as a way of thinking tied to a way of being that involves particular techniques, particular technologies. So in what we also know is that hominids, Homo sapiens particularly, but even ancient hominids like Neanderthals or Homo erectus, for instance, were also technological beings, because we know they made arrow points out of flint. And that's a technology. And their way of being was tied to flint making, okay? And creating tools from rock, basically. Using rock and to create and to shape and to hunt. So we know that we are, as human beings, as Homo sapiens, technological beings. So culture is a function of technologies in most ways. So technological study, check my time. All right, that's already 10 minutes. So Technologia, which is a concept that is important here, basically refers to systematic study. Okay. So it is a way of thinking born out of instruction. So if we think of the threefold tool of education, nature, art, and experience, Technologia is tied to art, to instruction. Okay, so systematic study. And for what purpose? To live a better life. Okay, so this is, we see this in Ramus, we see this in Harvey. I'm sorry, not Harvey. For those who read Harvey, and we see this with Amos. So it's a systematic study is really about forms of literacy, both reading and writing. You could include numeracy, adding and subtracting to a certain degree, but it's using reading and writing to improve life, to keep track of events of the day, to keep track of our experiences. Okay, so that's the relationship between art and exercise, right? We learn to read, we learn to write, we learn to speak well, okay? And as we move from a oral society to a literate society. We begin to keep track of our experiences through writing. And this is what technologia is really about. And this is, and all that Ames is talking about in this article are aspects of the liberal arts. Okay, and he breaks those down, which is an interesting way. He breaks those, through down into much greater than the seven liberal arts. All this too is tied to the idea. I'm sorry. So technology then, from its beginning, has a moral imperative. Okay, it's because art is meant to develop good action, which leads to good works. And through good action and good works, you demonstrate your salvation, and you demonstrate your spiritual and religious understanding of the world and how to live well and how to treat others well. So it has to do good for others. Okay? It is not a selfish paragraph. Okay? It is a giving paragraph. This is tied to the idea of one best method. The best method, let's say, to get to heaven, to earn salvation, or to demonstrate that you're saved, depending on your theological bent. Okay, so for Ames, go back to the notion of an art from the threefold tool. We talk about art as instruction, but an art is the organized knowledge around a particular topic. So for those seven liberal arts, it's the art of grammar, the art of rhetoric, how to speak well, the art of dialectic, how to think well, how to reason well, the art of music, the art of science, astronomy, the art of math and geometry, and different arts developed. Most of those stay. The trivium remains the same. The first three, the quadrivium, the four, get changed. We get towards philosophy and different types of science. And then as we move post-Ramus in the 17th century from the liberal arts to the humanities, then we begin to see what we understand as the modern subjects, geography and history, different forms of math and different sciences. But all these, in a sense, are art. And the notion of an art and science, there is not a distinction necessarily between an art and science, because it both are about known knowledge. Known knowledge. You can only teach, according to Aristotle, and I tend to agree, you can only teach what is known. In other words, you can only teach a knowledge, a mature knowledge, where there are not questions. With our current technological society, okay, where innovation is so sudden and rapid, okay, what we are able to do because of certain heuristics that develop around the technologies, we're able to learn the technology which cannot be taught. So the technologies aren't taught. How to live with these technologies aren't taught specifically. We develop our own understanding and our own knowledge of how to use the device and how to live our life. So this creates a kind of technological diversity, if you will, if a technology is a way of thinking born out how I use the device. Okay. Um, and so this is what we're faced with. And this is one of the reasons that teaching has become even harder, particularly in terms of how to get our students interested in the kind of mature knowledges that we are trying to teach them in formal classroom settings. So for AIMS, what's important for AIMS is that an art is the idea of eupraxia, which means good action. So an art has to lead to good action, which is methodically delineated. And here we see Ramos's influence, particularly in method, but is methodically delineated by universal rules. Okay. And basically, these universal rules around an art. So I'm familiar with history. Okay. Let's talk about history. We could talk about any of the sciences as well. But what we're teaching as we teach history are universal rules of how history functions as a literate device, as a literate way of learning about the world that we live in. Learning from the stories, this goes back to learning to the stories that we tell ourselves about who we are, okay, which is also a way to describe curriculum. So those in 503 recognize that comment from much earlier in the semester. Okay. AIMS is technometry, technologia, curriculum. We could interchange these three words. Okay. This is the study, as I sort of mentioned a minute ago. This is the study of the liberal arts. But what's interesting, it's a study of the liberal arts that begins the process to leave the liberal arts and move to the humanities. Okay, so by the end of I would argue that by the end of the 17th century, so by the end of the 1600s, we've begun to move the university from focusing on the liberal arts to beginning to focus on humanities. And there's a whole history around that that I talk about briefly, or we talk about briefly, I should say, in both AIMS and Ramos. Okay, so I also wanted to touch on the idea of calling. Now this, or vocation, I don't remember how many of you had me, some of you may have had me for 250 years ago, and there's an essay that you read, Teaching as Vocation, by Hubner. So this is really about the calling. And so basically calling in Ames's context, in the Puritan context, is a calling from God. And the Puritans generally would argue, and this is the way it was taught to me as a Catholic. So I think it went broader than just the Puritans. Although knowing my family background, there could be some Puritan influence in the way this was taught. But your first calling is you're calling from God, okay, to be a holy person. Okay? And for the Puritans, this is the most important calling. Many Puritan theologians argued for a secondary calling. And that secondary calling was your calling to a particular vocation. Okay? And it could be any vocation, from ditch digger to brain surgeon. The highest calling for Puritan clearly was to be a preacher, to be a divine, as they described it, and to also to be a teacher. Okay. They saw the teacher as being very close to the preacher. And in fact, many small towns throughout New England, for instance, your preacher was your teacher. He would preach on Sunday, but he would teach through the rest of the week. And as he would preach on Sunday, he would pass out a diagram, a map, if you will, of his sermon, and he would use that to teach through the week. Okay. So part of one of those technologies that fundamentally changes teaching, formal education, but I would also argue informal education, is the printing press. And we see this at work in how these Puritan preachers used text, not only at their sermons, but in their classrooms. Okay. So back to a calling. For Ames, he did not, well, he understood the notion of the secondary calling, the calling to occupation. He did not believe that it was necessarily a second calling, that when you're called to God, okay, God then gives you the gift of your vocation. So he did not see those actions as distinct. He saw those actions as a continuation. So the secondary calling for Ames was a continuation of the first. Because it is through your vocation that you would achieve your holiness or demonstrate your holiness. I'm moving back and forth between two different notions of grace, a Catholic notion and a Calvinist notion. So a few more things. Well, that was my timer. See what I can do in 5 minutes. I wanted to share this is Ames's Circle of Knowledge. And we can see the various arts. You see how Ames is moving beyond the liberal arts in his description. So you see up at Eupraxia at the top of the circle, you see the art of discoursing well and the art of living well. So there was a relationship between speaking well and living well. Okay. But this is a circle, so there's not necessarily a hierarchy. But you see that as part of eupraxia, the circle of knowledge. Okay. The art of next to physics. So logic is discoursing well. Theology is living well. Physics. And you see here there's 6 liberal arts, if you will. They're not 7. You see physics analyzing well. You see math is quantifying well. You see under rhetoric, the art of speaking and writing ornately, not well. Okay, so discoursing isn't necessarily just speech, it is also tied to writing. Rhetoric is just speaking and writing as well. So it's kind of interesting, these are kind of duplicates. Okay. And in grammar, the art of spelling and writing well. And it's interesting, here we are in around probably 1620, maybe early 1630s, because he dies before he's able to come over to New England. He's talking about spelling. This is the first instance where spelling seems to be important. In most early texts, particularly in the 16th century, so the 1500s, but even into the 1600s, you never see this idea of spelling. Anyway, so this is Ames' circle of knowledge. Stop sharing that. Go back. Share this again. So quickly, we lose what we lose in the years after Ames, and this notion of technology that's tied to a moral or religious imperative. Okay, the imperative becomes tied to a secular logic that basically argues if it can be used, it should be used. So usefulness overrides all other moral and ethical questions. Okay. So, some of us would question use of particular technologies. And we probably need to do that more because of the way that young people take the technologies and use them for their own device. So that's that's basically the my video discussion. If you have any questions, certainly about this, you can email. So y'all have a great day.